Merkel Media.
I'm exhausted, looking for everything in the shadows. Start looking at people like they don't matter. I'm waking up to the fact, more than a little bit shallow. I'm lost down this hole, but I don't wanna. I'm lost down this hole, 'cause I'm just trying to
What's good, guys? We're back with another episode, and this is a series that I'm about to do over the next 3 weeks. And I told you guys when I first started this podcast, I would eventually get to this series. And it's a series that I've done before, but not in series format. It was over the course of several podcasts, and it culminated on the confessionals, and then we had some weird stuff happen on that podcast, which then culminated in a 4.5-hour podcast where I broke down this particular theory, but there was also a lot of supernatural / paranormal activity that was going on too, and that kind of drove the catalyst of this. Plus, this was in the early days of me podcasting. So while I always have researched over my whole life, I will say in the past couple of years, my researching format has changed a lot. Plus, I've done more research since this series. So now I'm able to revisit this particular theory and expand upon it and look at it more thoroughly and really explain it in a way I think people will be able to understand it even better now. And again, without the supernatural / paranormal elements there, I think we're just going to look at the actual research behind the theory. And that way people can go to this series and say, okay, this was the full expanded version of this. Very similar to what I did with Good Nephilim when I first went on the confessionals and talked about it. I've expanded on it way more since then, and I've done more research, still doing research on it. So this will be a very similar topic, and it's the Nephilim Portal Babies theory. And you may have seen the Nephilim Portal Babies t-shirts in the merch store. Some people may know what it was from. Some people may not know what it's from. Well, after this series, you'll definitely know where it's from. And today we're actually going to break down what is a Nephilim. And I know some people may be rolling their eyes in the back of their heads. Oh my God, I don't need to hear the bare bones of what Nephilim are. I already know what they are. And I get it. And I want to say to you guys, I'm hoping today I'm going to present some information you haven't heard about the origins of the Nephilim. And for people that are new to the YouTube channel or new to the podcast on any of the RSS formats like Spotify or Apple Podcast, that this will give you a good basis as we move into some of the deeper aspects of what a Nephilim Portal Baby is. And I know that name sounds crazy. And yeah, it's a little clickbaity, very similar to Good Nephilim, because I know when people initially hear Good Nephilim, they're like, what are you talking about? And they freak out. And then they actually listen to the series. And I've had so many people reach out to me that had that initial reaction, and they listened to this whole series and they hit me up and said, man, I really appreciate that. I didn't really know what you meant by that. And as a matter of fact, just so people know too, I tend to label a lot of the names of my podcast and even some of the descriptive names on YouTube to be a little more clickbaity. I do it on two accounts. One account is, especially when I'm talking about the occult and alchemy and Gnosticism, my hope is there are people who aren't Christians who will come in just seeing the topic matter, and they will get a different perspective on topics they may already know or at least know a little bit about. So at least they're getting a Christian perspective, and then they can make their own decision from it from that point. And me being a Christian, I want people to definitely have that particular aspect as well. So then they can make their own informed decision. And the second reason is I know that in this community, in the truther community, that people aren't really that good at researchers. Let's be honest, guys. And for the most part, not everybody's that critical of a thinker in the truther or conspiratorial community. That's why I started this podcast, because I know that there is what we call the mainstream, which would be the quote unquote normies that people talk about, right? You got the mainstream, but then you got the truther community, and you got the mainstream truther community. The mainstream truther community, there are major topics that are talked about across the board. And if you disagree with said topics, then you are considered to be a normie mainstreamer, not that you're actually a critical thinker. So in saying all that, I do put the label on my podcast names or on the YouTube descriptors. I do it for those two reasons, because I know that there are people who go 0 to 60 who are quote unquote truthers or Christian truthers. They see a headline and they react emotionally because of it. And again, back to no research involved, just seeing a headline and getting emotional. So back to why that I do that. I do it to bring in people who aren't Christians to get a different perspective. And then I typically weed out people that I know who aren't really critical thinkers. And I'm going to be honest with you, most of the truth or conspiratorial community really aren't critical thinkers. They're just as easily persuaded and moved around by people and people in power as much as the people they rail against, who they say are also manipulated. If everyone was a critical thinker in this world, or even just say the truther community as a whole, they were all critical thinkers, we'd be a lot better off, right? Just know that when you react or when you actually research, that means that you're putting in the work. That means that you're not just reading a headline and flipping out, or you're just taking one person's perspective on something. You need to look at multiple perspectives to then hopefully go through the Word of God, hopefully go through prayer, and then being able to decipher that. And back to Nephilim Portal Babies, because again, it's a very clickbaity name, and there's a reason for that, because we will talk about what that actually means. What does it mean at the root core? But we got to build to there, right? Like I do with any series that I do, we got to build to there. So we want to build to what they are by starting at the fundamentals. We want to get to what are the Nephilim, and we are going to talk about some different aspects of the Nephilim today that I haven't talked about on any episodes I've done before. So just know we're not going to rehash everything you've heard before. And then the next episode, we're really going to get into Evil Cain, and we're going to talk about the Brotherhood of the Snake, because that's very important to build also to this narrative. And then in the last episode, we're going to really get into the homunculus. We're really going to get into the modern UFO and gray alien movement. And that's going to build us into what I think is going on here in the future. Now, again, this is a theory that I built, and this is something that I've done through a ton of different avenues of research, but again, it's just a theory. It doesn't mean that it's fact. And I wish more researchers would be upfront and honest about that when they present theories, instead of saying this is verbatim a fact, and if you don't believe this, then you're the enemy. You're a controlled op, you are a fed, or whatever else. We all know all the tropes within this community. If you disagree with anyone, then you're the enemy. And I don't think that should be that way, but that goes back to what I just said in this little deviation from the episode when I said that most people aren't critical thinkers, because critical thinking allows you to listen to information that you don't agree with in the beginning. And when you do all the research, you may still not agree with it, but at least you have the basis to be able to combat it. And I think for me, that's what I really try to challenge myself to do, is not fall into confirmation bias, not try to look for information that's going to prove my theory. I try to initially look for information that's going to disprove it, because if I come up with a mountain of evidence that disproves it, well, then I need to start reevaluating that theory instead of trying to use confirmation bias to prove it. So today we're going to build the basis. We're going to build to it. And by the time we get to part 3, we'll have laid this whole thing out. And then you can walk away from it and say, hey, I like it, or I don't like it at all, Joel. And I've done all this other research that disproves it completely, and I'm perfectly fine with that too. You know how I am here, guys. If you disagree with me, that's good. That means you're actually using your brain and you're not believing everything I'm telling you, which I hope I'm not trying to make you believe anything either. I'm just doing research and building theories upon research, which sometimes it's just provable fact. We know that we can look in history and say, well, that happened, right? What's up, guys? Real quick before we jump back into the show, for people who have been asking how to support the show financially, you can support in a few ways. First, you can become a member here on YouTube. We have 3 different tiers and custom emojis for you to use on this channel. You can also go to buymeacoffee.com/freetherabbits and become a monthly member or make a one-time donation. If you're looking for some great merch to wear this fall and winter, like our new Faith Turns Promise into Prophecy and I'm a Free Range Rabbit merch, go to freetherabbits.myshopify.com for tons of options, and we're always updating the store with new items. And lastly, for anyone looking for any of the films that I've been in, like Expedition Dogman, Sasquatch and the Missing Man, or our brand new film, The Meadow Project, head over to merkelfilms.com to stream them now. All right, guys, let's get back into the show. So we're going to start with the classic verses that you've always heard, but we're going to break them down a little further today. We're going to start with Genesis 6, and we're going to go 1 through 4 here. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These are the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Now, we will look throughout this episode at the Hebrew. We are going to look at some Greek words too, because we're going to do some comparative verses here in a minute when we're talking about the sons of God and what those actually mean. Now, the sons of God here, when it says the sons of God came into the daughters of man, this is not referring to the sons of Seth or these judges, these rulers who turned from the Adamic line and corrupted these women. No, these are the sons of God, which is only used 5 times in the Old Testament, and they all mean the same thing. It is Beni Ha Elohim, or Beni Elohim. In this particular case, it's Beni Ha Elohim, and it literally means angels, the sons of Elohim. And I'm going to show you the verses in the Old Testament so we know that that's exactly what it's talking about. And it's a phrase used in the Old Testament and in the Christian Apocrypha. And we will talk about some of the Apocrypha today as well. It's also used in the Kabbalah, where Beni Elohim are a part of different Jewish angelic hierarchies. And depending on what books you're looking at, whether it's the Zohar or the Mishneh Torah. There's several different ones. We're not going to go through all this today. We're not doing a whole episode on the Kabbalah. That would take too many episodes. And eventually I will do some more deep dives into the Kabbalah. And again, it is Jewish mysticism, and I'm not here to tout the Kabbalah, but it doesn't mean that we can't look and read things out of the Kabbalah and understand how they connect to the Bible. And I think it's important to do that. And that's one of the things I try to do here on the show is go through things that are the complete opposite of a biblical perspective to understand how the other side operates. And specifically when it comes to angelic beings, we know that there are fallen angels. We know there are evil angels. We know that the hierarchies exist within that side too. So we can always look and try to understand some of these things as a whole. So we've got like the Erolim, obviously the Seraphim, the Aphanim, we got the Elim, we have the Beni Elohim, which we just talked about. We got the Ishim, we got the Cherubim, and we have the Malachim, which is generally messengers. I always talk about the Malachim being like the lowest tier on the totem pole. Again, there are different hierarchies all over the place. This is just one particular, but this is the Kabbalah's version, and this is where you're going to find these Beni Elohim. So in the early writings of the Hebrew Bible, the sons of God, which are considered messengers, and they are the Beni Ha Elohim in heaven, and they are depicted as the heavenly court or the pantheon of beings. Some consider them part of the divine council, and this is where we get into Psalm 82, and we won't really get into that today. We'll maybe talk about it briefly, but it's not really important to this particular idea of the Nephilim, because that's what we're really trying to get to, right? But we need to set the tone and understand in the Old Testament, when we see sons of God, in the few times that it's used, it means angelic beings. This is not men. And I know that the modern Christian, many of them will try to prove that that's what it is. And it's just not. When you look at the grouping of the 5 verses and what they mean in those 5 verses, it's actually angelic beings. And we know that these sons of God, they lusted after the daughters of men, and they begot these giants, these Nephilim. And we're going to talk about different giants today too, because there's more than one kind. And the Bible talks about all these different kinds specifically. As a matter of fact, a lot of these different tribes and groups that were in the promised land before Joshua and Caleb go back in to take it, a lot of them had mixed bloodlines all through them. And that's where I get the basis of the good Nephilim, because of so much of the bloodlines being intermixed all the way down to now. That would be virtually impossible for anybody to get into heaven if you can't get into heaven if you have an ounce of Nephilim blood in you. So as we're looking at Genesis 6 further, we're going to look at some of the different versions, the source versions for this. We're going to look at the manuscripts. The Septuagint has emendations to read sons of God as angels. So these emendations are next to the sons of God to let you know that they are angel kind. And the Septuagint, and it's sometimes referred to as the Greek Old Testament, or the translation of the 70. It's the earliest extant Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible from the original biblical Hebrew. So the story is that it's recorded in the letter Aristeas to Philocrates that the laws of the Jews were translated into the Greek language at the request of Ptolemy II by 72 Hebrew translators, and 6 were from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Josephus, in which we've talked about Josephus plenty of times on this show, and we'll actually talk about him a little bit later on this episode when we're talking about giants. And he paraphrases about 2/5 of the letter, and he says that this letter of Aristeas to Philocrates actually happened. And this is where we get the idea of the Septuagint being directly from the Hebrew manuscripts. And a small caveat, you're going to have some guys out there running around saying that the Hebrew Bible did not exist first, that it was the Septuagint. And I think we all know who one particular guy is that's running around saying that, but he's also the same guy who thinks Jesus is a boy lover. So again, I won't take away from the guy's acumen, but that just because you have a certain scholarly acumen does not mean that you are correct. As a matter of fact, many people with scholarly acumens can be very corrupt or corrupted by negative entities and sources on the outside. And the reason why that this Septuagint needed to happen was because few people could speak and even fewer could even read the Hebrew language during the Second Temple period. So the Koine Greek and Aramaic were the most prominent languages at the time in the Jewish community. So the Septuagint satisfied the need for Jewish people to have the Old Testament written in those languages, specifically the Koine Greek. So back to these codexes and these manuscripts, we're going to look at the Codex Vaticanus, and it's another manuscript of the Greek Bible. It's containing the majority of the Greek Old Testament, the majority of the New Testament, and along with Codex Sinaiticus and Alexandrinus is one of the earliest, most complete manuscripts of the Bible. Most scholars consider Codex Vaticanus to be one of the most important Greek witnesses to the Greek text of the New Testament, followed by Codex Sinaiticus. So it's a very important early text that we look at, and its original translation was angels. It actually wasn't even sons of God. So angels was in the Codex Vaticanus. So again, we're looking at the earliest manuscripts that we can, and we know that the verbiage is angels, even in Codex Vaticanus. So I have a very hard time with scholars that try to gloss over that these are angelic beings that are the sons of God in the Old Testament. It's virtually impossible to do so. And I believe it's just people who really don't want to believe in the more supernatural aspects of the Bible. So the Codex Alexandrinus, it's a manuscript of the Greek Bible written on parchment. Using the study of comparative writing styles, it has been dated to the 5th century. And it's one of the earliest and most complete manuscripts of the Bible, along with Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. In Alexandrinus, sons of God has actually been taken out and replaced by angels. So in every single early manuscript, it was always either there was a sidebar that said, hey, this is what sons of God means, it's angels, or it just was angels in these manuscripts. So now we're going to look at the Old Testament verses that talk about sons of God, and we're going to look at the context, right? We're going to look at the context of where it's used, how it's used, and we're going to know that it means angels. And I want to say something real quick, because I've been seeing some stuff rolling around in the community when it comes to certain biblical theories that are really hot right now, and a lot of cherry picking going on with Bible verses to prove certain theories. And I won't get into said theories today, but just know I'm coming with some massive series that I've been working on some of these theories. But one of the things they'll tell people is don't listen to others when they say that context matters, because they will claim that these verses mean these things, but they take them completely out of context. And I want to tell you right now, if you ever hear someone say, well, if people don't agree with this theory, they're going to say stuff like, look at the context, don't listen to them. I mean, I've read books on certain theories that are going around right now that say that verbatim in the books. I will tell you right now, do not listen to those people. Walk away from those people. They are either deceived or they're false prophets, because context matters. Context matters in anything. You could record a line out of my podcast today, and you could put it out there and say, look what he said. And it could sound awful without the context, without the prior 5 minutes and the 5 minutes after, or however long that's needed to understand what that line means. I want to say that right now. That really bothers me that that's going around, that context doesn't matter. Context matters in everything, not just the Bible. It matters in everything in life. That is the most ludicrous statement that people could make to try to prove their theory. Do not listen to them when they say that. Please, I'm begging you right now, because that is the sign of someone who is filled with confirmation bias and who is not being an ethical researcher. Off my soapbox and on to these verses in the Old Testament. Again, context matters. That's why I brought that up. So Job 38:7, when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Sons of God, Beni Elohim. Ben which is the root word of bene, is son, descendant, member of a group. Elohim is God, gods, divine beings, judges. And another thing about Elohim, I've heard people say when we're looking at biblical representations of Elohim, that it's just singular. That's absolutely false to the max. When you're looking at Elohim in the Hebrew, it is a word that can be used in the singular or plural, depending on, guess what, the context. So context matters again, guys. We have to look at context. So in Job 38:7, we are talking about all of the sons of God shouted for joy because it's talking about the morning stars sang together. So this verse is definitely talking about angels. So Genesis 6:2, which we already talked about, we have Beni Ha Elohim, sons of God. So we just explained what Bene was, and Elohim means the same thing. Job 1:6. Now this is very important. Again, context. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. Satan came with them. So we're talking about negative entities. These sons of God, Beni Ha Elohim, the exact same thing. Angels. So these were fallen angels that came with Satan. So now some people may say that, oh, these were angels that allowed Satan to come in per Yahweh's request, and they brought him in. That could be argued too, right? From what it appears to be to me, that these were some of his own ilk that came with him. But I'm not going to knock you if you argue differently, and I could be wrong. So we got Job 2:1. Again, there was a day when the sons of God, Beni Ha Elohim, came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. So this is when Satan came back again. This is when they're testing Job. This is when God's allowing Satan to test Job, the accuser. So now we've got Psalm 82:6. And we've already talked about Psalm 82. I said, you are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. Gods is Elohim in the plural. Most High is El Yon, which is the Most High. It means El. It means Yahweh. So this is another verse where we are talking about gods being the children of the Most High, the Elohim. These are angels. So here are 5 verses that specifically talk about angel kind. So it's very difficult for me to see the verses in Job, the verse in Psalms, and then to go and say, oh, well, the sons of God in Genesis 6, that's different. Those are human. Sorry, that doesn't work because it's the exact same Hebrew translations from the other verses. So it would have to be a different translation for it to mean human beings, to mean mankind. So when you hear people that try to argue that, just pull those other verses out to them and say, what do these mean in the Hebrew? What does that mean in the Hebrew? Ask the deep question. Ask them that when they try to bring that up to you. Here's some other verses that they will use to try to prove their point. They'll go to the New Testament because the sons of God is used in the New Testament. We're going to look at Romans 8. We're going to look at verse 14. For as many are led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God. For you did not receive the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you received the spirit of adoption by whom we cry out, Abba, Father. So the spirit of adoption, this is being adopted into the kingdom of God. So this is a different type of sons of God. This is not the sons of God, the angel kind who are already with God. And the word sons is hoyos. And hoyos primarily means son, child, or descendant, but it can signify follower, apprentice, one who shares a common origin, characteristic, or purpose. So generally speaking, this is talking about a descendant in any generation. So this will specifically talk to humans or mankind, the sons of God, actual sons of God, descendants, which could mean women as well. This isn't just indicative of men. And it's talking about the spirit of adoption. Angel kind are not being adopted. So this is completely different than the sons of God in the Old Testament. And again, you got to look at the Koine Greek, you have to look at the Hebrew, and you have to look at the context. These things matter when you're looking at the Bible. Reading the Bible is one thing, but studying it is a completely different thing. And I recently worked with Ed Mabry on a project which will come out later, a few months from now. And that's something he always says. There's a difference between reading the scripture and studying the scripture. And a lot of times, again, people, when they're trying to prove something, they will cherry pick verses and they don't really understand them. They don't understand the culminate Greek. They don't understand the Hebrew. They don't understand the context of the culture during that time. All those things matter. All these things matter when we're looking at the deeper layers of the text. So another verse they'll use is Matthew 5:44. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the sons of your Father in heaven. Sons is hoyo, and it means the exact same thing that we talked about, descendants. And again, we're not talking about angels here. We're talking about doing good to those who spitefully use you and persecute you. These are people on earth. This is mankind, not angel kind singing to God in heaven. They're not going before God with the accuser, Satan, to test Job. So again, context, we look at it and we're able to see the difference between sons of God in the Old Testament, which is only used 5 times, and sons of God in the New Testament, which we are reading a few of these verses. And Luke 20:36, here's a good one because it's got a nice little juxtaposition there. Nor can they die anymore, for they are equal to the angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection. So we have angels, which in the Greek is sangeloi, and then we have sons, which is hoyo. So we have the perfect juxtaposition there. We have angels and sons, and we have mankind, which is the descendants, which are sons of God, and it says they're equal to the angels. And that verse has got way more layers to it, which we won't get into today because there's more to that verse that it means when we break it all the way down. But that'll be for a different day. I just want to talk about the difference, the comparative between sons and angels there. So again, New Testament knew what they were talking about just as much as the Old Testament did. So just use these verses and use the comparative verses. If someone comes to you and tries to say that they're the sons of Seth or these were human beings who were corrupted in Genesis 6, just show them the other 4 verses in the Old Testament and then talk about the verses that I mentioned in the New Testament as comparative verses and say it actually doesn't add up because they're not the same thing. So we're going to go to the second mention of the Nephilim, which is in Numbers 13:32 through 33. And we're going to read 3 different versions of this because I like to look at the KJV for one. I love the Berean, which is probably my favorite translation these days. And I'm also going to look at the Douay-Rheims Bible, which I've talked about before on this show. And they all have a little bit different way of looking at it, but they all mean the same thing. So KJV, and they brought up an evil report of the land, which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, the land, though which we have gone to search it, is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof, and all the people that we saw in it are men of great stature. Verse 33, and there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Look at the Berean. So they gave the Israelites a bad report about the land they had spied out. The land we explored devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw there are in great stature. We even saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak that come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in our own sight. We must have seen the same to them. And that's why I like the Berean, because they hone in really hard on the Hebrew words and even the Koine Greek words. To me, I think you get a better true translation, but I always say look at multiple translations and then always go to the Hebrew and Greek and you'll really get to the bottom of it. But I love that translation there because we get Nephilim twice. Douay-Rheims, verse 32, and they spoke ill of the land which they had viewed before the children of Israel, saying, the land which we have viewed devoureth its inhabitants. The people that we beheld are of tall stature. There we saw certain monsters of the sons of Enoch, of the giant kind, in comparison of whom we seem like locusts. I thought that was a very interesting translation. Monsters of the son of Enoch, of the giant kind. So I do like the Douay-Rheims because they love using the word giants in the Douay-Rheims. So you'll get a lot of giant verbiage throughout the Old Testament. So when we're looking at stature in the Hebrew, and this would be applicable to all these verses, we have middot, M-I-D-D-O-W-T, and it's a derivative of middah, which is measurement, stature, or size. And in this conjunction with tall, we have a very, very tall being. We have a Nephilim. As a matter of fact, that is the translation of the word Nephilim there in Hebrew, which is giants, and that is a derivative. Nephil, which is Naphal, which means to fall, and we're going to get into some etymology here in a minute. I promise we're going to get into some etymology when we're talking about where the word Nephilim came from, because Nephal is generally what people talk about because it's the Hebrew word. And we're also going to talk about Anak, because Anak is used in this verse as well, the Anakim, and we're going to talk specifically of the root word of that, Anaki, and we will break that down here in a second because we're about to jump into the etymology. So the Brown Drivers Briggs Lexicon, and it's a standard reference for biblical Hebrew and biblical Aramaic, and it was published in 1906. It gives the meaning of Nephilim as giants. And it does say, though, that the proposed etymologies of the word are all precarious. So they're looking at context when they are looking at the word meaning giants. Now, I know there's some ideas, especially when we're looking at the Aramaic, and I'm going to get into what the meaning of it in Aramaic is. And this is, I think, where we get more of the derivative giants from. I just think that we're looking at the context as a whole. And if we're looking at these angels who are mating with women willingly or unwillingly, and I think that could be argued both ways, actually. I think there might have been a little bit of both. These Gibberim, which we're going to be talking about Gibberim in a minute too, because we're going to break down that word and break down some really interesting stuff when it comes to the walls of Jericho and just Jericho in general. But regardless, if we're looking at fallen angels mating with women, that these monstrous beings are not human, right? So this is where we get the idea of the Nephilim being used as giants. So most people think it comes from the Hebrew verbal root NPL, which is fall or Nephal. Most of the biblical translations, with some of them we've already talked about, Septuagint, Theodotion, Latin Vulgate, among many others, interpret the word to mean giants. So we know this has been talked about since the early Israelites. They knew what they were. So Nephal in Hebrew means fallen or to fall, and the im means it's plural. Could also be Nephil, Nephel, which literally means untimely birth, abortion, or miscarriage. So the argument for that being a derivative of it is that the Nephilim aren't fully human and therefore shouldn't be alive. So that's another root word that it could be. I lend more to Nephal, but also the Aramaic Naphil, which means fallen one who causes falling. And here's another interesting caveat to it. It can also be used to refer to a demon and is the name of a lizard. So I thought that was interesting too. So I believe that gives us another idea for Nephilim referring to giants. Also, some scholars believe that Rapha or the Raphaim, which is also translated as giant in the Old Testament, is some people's minds a better word for what these hybrids should be called. I'm going to argue today that I think the Rephaim is a lesser version of the Nephilim. But again, it's all under the same umbrella. So you could just say Rephaim, Nephilim. We'll get into the Zuzim, the Horim, all that today too. So, but to talk about the Rephaim, the word Rapha is also used in the Hebrew to mean ghosts of the dead, shades, or spirits. And this also plays into the Nephilim, specifically the ones that died in the flood, whose souls had nowhere to go, that they are roaming the earth, and they are the demons that oppress and possess us today. So we will get into that at the very end of this when we get into the Book of Enoch. And this is going to build into this Nephilim Portal Baby idea, because we need to understand that there are spirits, these demons that are among us, that are all over the place. They're looking for host bodies. And this is a very important concept that we need to understand now as we go throughout this Nephilim Portal Baby theory. So, description of the Nephilim. One, some scholars, and this isn't a provable fact, and I'll tell you where I think they get it from. They say that the ratio was a 2-to-1 build, which means that if they were 12 feet tall, they'd be 6 feet wide. Now, I believe they get this idea from bone density accounts of giant bones that have been found over the past few hundred years. That's where I believe. Now, we don't have any definitive proof of that. We would need to have bones in front of us to be able to look at it. It does seem that these giants were not walking around falling all over the place, like they were too tall and skinny at the same time. They seem to be built for battle, built for war, fast, quick, and agile. So I believe that's another reason that we lend more to this 2-to-1 build. But again, it's not a provable thing. This is just a speculation, a theory that some scholars have put out there. And again, just like the 2-to-1 build, the double rows of teeth are not provable biblically. But this is where we get the idea from this from. And we got more substantial basis for this. And the concept of the double rows of teeth comes from the alleged witnesses to these giant skeletons that were generally found in North America at mound builder sites, and a lot of them had double rows of teeth. Matter of fact, we had a guy on the confessionals named TJ who met with myself and Cribbers of the Corn and Tony. He came in and told some wild paranormal tales he's had over his whole life. He's seen Bigfoot over 15 times. And that's just one thing that he's seen. He's seen Pale Walker. He's seen an inordinate amount of orbs. And he, when he was a child, and he's fairly tall, he's about 6'4", 6'5", he had double rows of teeth. Him and his brother had have them all pulled out. And he's had a crazy connection to the supernatural since he was a kid. Matter of fact, one crazy story was when he went out into the woods to hunt a deer for the first time. He had a bow and arrow. When he got there, he felt this need to put down the bow and arrow, and he laid down. He said he put his hands on the ground. He said he could feel nature, which is super weird. When he looked up, there were all of these animals surrounding him. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs when she's out in the woods. So I told him, I was like, man, that's crazy. But he has had some things that lend to this idea. He's had some super tall people in his family too. And it's very possible that he could be from some sort of bloodline. And again, we're just speculating. We don't know for sure, but he does have some of these traits. And this is where we get the idea of the double rows of teeth from, because we've heard of so many skeletons that have been found that had them. But just know that's not a biblical thing. When people talk about the double rows of teeth, 6 fingers and 6 toes, that actually is biblical. So we will look at 1 Chronicles 26. Yet again, there was a war at Gath where a man of great stature whose fingers and toes were 4 and 20, 6 on each hand and 6 on each foot. And he was also the son of a giant. So we do know that biblically that at least this particular giant, but it lends to the idea that they all had 6 fingers and 6 toes. This is where we get that idea from when it comes to Nephilim. Also, the Book of Enoch talks about that the original giants are said to be 300 cubits tall. Now, most scholars think this was a copying error, because when you look at what a cubit was, it was roughly 18 inches. So 300 cubits would be 150 yards, which would be 450 feet tall. I don't know about that, guys. I'm not going to say no, because I always leave things in the realm of possibility when it comes to stuff we have no clue about. But I got a hard time thinking that there was just tons of these 450 foot tall giants running around. Just saying. And this would be one of the reasons why that the Book of Enoch is not considered canonical by most people. And I would be one of those people that does not consider the Book of Enoch canonical. I think there are some things in the Book of Enoch that lend to the side of caution. And maybe one day I'll do an episode, maybe on all 3 books of Enoch, because really the first book of Enoch is the only one that's even attributed to the real Enoch, and the other 2 were written by rabbis much, much, much later. And we can get into some of those ideas about Enoch. I think the last 2 specifically are more Gnostic in nature, whereas the first one I think holds way more weight. We know that the Book of Enoch's talked about in the Bible as well. So I do think that it's a very important document for sure. But again, there are some things that will raise your eyebrow. And if you think it should be in there, that's cool, man. Read it. You know what I mean? I read it all the time, and I think it's a very important text anyway. So to get to more giant verses, We got Deuteronomy 3:11. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained the remnant of the giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. It is not in Rabbath of the children of Ammon. 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth of it, after a cubit of a man, which we've talked about Og plenty of times on the show, but I'm just reading some of these verses to refresh our memory on some of these verses that have giants in them. We have 1 Samuel 17:4. There went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span, which people think it's generally around anywhere from 9 to 11 feet. That's how tall Goliath was, which at a 2-to-1 ratio, he would have been pretty quick if that's the case. We have Amos 2:9, yet destroyed I the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and he was strong as the oaks, yet I destroyed his fruit from above and his roots from beneath. So we know the original Amorites were super tall. And what's interesting, the cedars of Lebanon were said to be around 40 to 100 feet in height, with a massive trunk up to 40 to 80 feet in diameter. So I land on the side of the 40 feet, 35, 40 feet, 45 feet range. If we're going to talk about really tall giants, that might have been in that max range for me. That's just how I'm thinking. Again, open to being wrong about that. If we think there's 450-foot giants running around at some point, cool, man. I mean, that's just even doper in my opinion. So, but again, this is more what I think. And I think we probably trickled down from that 40 foot all the way down to where we got around that 9, 10 foot and everything in between, right? So to get into the Gibborim now, and Gibborim is an interesting word. It's a Hebrew word that can mean mightiest, and the root word is gabber, which we've talked about, which means mighty, and it is used in the Hebrew Bible to describe people who are valiant, mighty, great stature. But depending on, hey, here's that word again, context that the word Gibborim's used in, specifically in Genesis 6:4, it describes the Nephilim. It actually becomes a form of giant as well. And we're going to talk about different words in different contexts. But again, the word Gibber and Gibborim's also used for David's mighty men. But you know how I feel about some of David's mighty men. I think they were actually Nephilim, and giants or hybrids. And if you're interested in hearing me talk about that, I've got a 4-part series right now you can go listen to called Good Nephilim, and I break that down a little bit further. So we're going to really get into the Gibborim's connection to Jericho, because this is going to break down more of that context of what Gibborim are and how they are giants depending on the context. Now, Jericho is actually one of the oldest and most important cities of all time. The modern excavations confirm the city is in great antiquity and tons of battles there. It's a super sacred place. But in ancient times, Jericho was known as the city of giants because it was inhabited by giants called the Gibborim. And because this Hebrew term Gibborim is used in conjunction with Jericho and these mighty men, these giants, they were considered to be the Nephilim's offspring. And this is where we're going to get into some of those different ideas. And listen, guys, I'm going to tell you right now, nobody's got the answer. I can say what I think today. I could be completely wrong, and somebody else could say what they say, and they could also be completely wrong. Or I could be right, or they could be right. You know, I will say this, when it comes to Nephilim, I use it kind of as an overarching umbrella. Everything else kind of falls underneath. And could they be equal to the Nephilim? Could they be talking about the Nephilim themselves? It's very possible. Are some of these other groups just a derivative off of the original Nephilim? Is Nephilim just the name for all of them, and then they all have their different traits and abilities? Who knows, right? But typically what I think when I think of Nephilim, they're like the originals. And then we've got the Gibborim, which could also be attributed to the original Nephilim, and then you could also attribute them to a lesser version of the Nephilim. And I'll be honest with you, I go in and out. I'll just say Nephilim sometimes, and I'm just talking about giants. And sometimes I'm talking about the original guys. And then I may talk about the Horim and the Zuzim and the Anakim, and they're a little bit different because they're more down the line and they got a more diluted bloodline. So again, I can even be all over the place with this. But for today, in the context of it, we're talking about these Gibborim and Jericho would definitely be a lesser form of the original Nephilim, which would be like the OGs, right? and the formidable and enormous walls of the ancient city of Jericho, which we knew they had massive walls. And we know of the entire story of Joshua in the Battle of Jericho and marching around the city 7 times and the walls falling down with the power of God. There's a reason for that, because it was a city of giants. And this view is actually supported by many scholars who connect Jericho's massive fortifications to the mythologies of the giant builders, the Cyclops. And we're going to talk about them today too, because we're specifically talking about wall builders. And the walls of Jericho was a highly fortified city. It was actually double layered, high and formidable walls with rectangular towers for defense. So like the sheer size and the strength of these walls has led to a lot of speculation from a lot of scholars that these weren't built by human beings, that this was built by these wall builders, these giants, these Cyclops. As a matter of fact, Ronald S. Hendel, and he's been a member of the Berkeley faculty since 1999, and he served as chair of Jewish Studies, the Department of Near Eastern Studies, and the graduate program in Ancient History and Mediterranean Archaeology. And he approaches the Hebrew Bible from a variety of angles. He looks at history, textual criticism. He looks at linguistics, comparative mythology, literature, cultural memory. He goes into all these different facets of it. And he said, when he connected the enormous walls of Jericho to the ancient Greek cities of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Argos in Greek mythology were built by the giant builders, the Cyclops. So that was his link to the walls of Jericho being built by giants and also Jericho being inhabited by giants. And we're going to look at the Cyclops a little bit so we can understand wall builders. So there's actually 3 groups of Cyclops. We've got the Hesiotic, the Homeric, and the wall builders. And the last one we're going to talk about is the wall builders. And we're not going to get into the first 2, but the Hesiotic is built on Hesiod's theogony. And this is where he talks about the Cyclops are 3 brothers, and they're the sons of Uranus and Gaia, and a massive mythological story there, which I do think is based in some sort of truth. And we got Homer's Odyssey, and these Cyclops are this uncivilized group of shepherds, and one of them is the son of Poseidon, and he's actually encountered by Odysseus. But we want to get to the wall builders, because these are the ones that are tied directly into Jericho. And it said the Cyclops were said to have been the builders of the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Argos. And although they can be seen as being distinct, the Cyclopean wall builders share several features with the Hesiodic Cyclops. So they're both craftsmen of supernatural skill, they have enormous strength, and they lived in primordial times. And this is also interesting, that the huge walls of Mycenae, Tiryns are composed of these stones that are so huge that the ordinary man can't move. Many archaeologists have looked at it. Many scholars have looked at it. It's a lot like many other megaliths around the world where we're trying to figure out how it was done. But I believe this also ties in to the fact that they were master builders. They were famous in antiquity from at least the 5th century BC onward. So I looked at master builders when they're attributed to being master builders, like, oh, Freemasons, master builders. This ties back into what? Cain and his son Enoch, the evil Enoch, and then subsequently Tubal-Cain, which we're all going to talk about in episode 2, because I think it's very important to understand the first secret society, the Brotherhood of the Snake, and what trickled out all other secret societies from it. But it's all built on building, masonry, which is where Freemasonry comes from, the master builders. But this is what these Cyclops were, these wall builders. They were master masons. As a matter of fact, the natural philosopher Pliny the Elder, who I love talking about any chance I get, and I talked about him a lot in the Cynocephalus episode of the dog-headed man. And in his book, Natural History, he reported a tradition, and this was attributed to Aristotle, that the Cyclops are inventors of masonry towers. He also talks about the Cyclops as being among those credited with being the first to work iron as well as bronze. And he said there are many other monuments outside of the walls that were also attributed to the Cyclops. So I think this, again, this goes all the way back to the origins of the Nephilim, the first secret society, the Brotherhood of the Snake, the original version of Freemasonry. We're going to talk about Cain. We're going to talk about his son, Evil Enoch, and we're going to talk about Tubal Cain and their connection to the Nephilim, which is very important. But here we are with these wall builders, these Cyclops, and they are attributed to these walls of Jericho. So to get the actual tie-in to the walls of Jericho, we got to look at the story of Jericho. And this is in Joshua 6. This is 1 through 27, but we're actually going to look at Joshua 6 too, because this is where we get this Nephilim connection. So the Lord speaking to Joshua, and he says, "And the Lord says unto Joshua, See, I have given into thine hand Jericho, and the king thereof, and the mighty men of valor." And mighty men here is Gibberim, and it is a reference to these giants. And this is a tie-in back to Genesis 6:4, where we're talking about the Gibberim being giants there. So in the scriptures, it said that the Hebrews set fire to the whole city of Jericho, and none they found inside were alive. And that's none they found inside. They burned everything around the city of Jericho, and they tore down structures that escaped the fire. So the question is, did the Gibberim there in Jericho all die? It seems so, because of them burning the city and them not finding any, but that doesn't mean some didn't escape. And there are actually some sources that state a few Gibberim managed to escape. So according to the Jewish Encyclopedia, those who did survive were led by a certain Ifrikish ibn Qas to Africa. And having killed the king of that country, they settled there. And this is where they say the Berbers are the descendants of. So there's some interesting things with the Berbers. And I've done some research a couple of years ago on the Berbers, and I may break down very interesting ties with the Berbers to giants and Nephilim. This is one particular story of this Ifrikish ibn Qas, and we're going to talk about who Ibn Qas is as we get a little deeper here. And to get to there, we're going to have to look at some Arabic literature too. And as a matter of fact, in the Quran, giants are mentioned in connection with the 12 spies sent by Moses to explore lands of Canaan. And they've got a little different take on some of these stories in the Bible. Obviously, they do talk about Og, and they actually say that when he went out to fight Moses, he tore out a mountain, put it on his head, and he was going to throw it at the Israelites and crush them. But then God sent a bird that bored a hole in the mountain, which then fell on Og's neck, and then Og died. In the Quran, it talks about Ifrikish ibn Qas went to Africa and killed the king of that country and settled there. And this is where you get the idea of the Berbers being the descendants. But who is Ifrikish ibn Qas? Well, let's go to 2 Samuel 21:16. And I've talked about this giant quite a bit. And Ishbi-Benob, which was of the sons of the giant, the weight of whose spear weighed 300 shekels of brass in weight, he being girded with a new sword thought to have slain David. And we know that sword is a Hebrew word that we do not know the translation for. We know that a new is hadese in Hebrew, but after that, we don't know what that word is. And they have tried to everything in that place, armor, spear, mace, nobody knows. And I have argued that that does not have a descriptor because it was a piece of technology, some sort of Nephilim magic technology that he broke out on David when he was trying to kill him. And I think it's an interesting thought. And I think that we can look and say that we have a good basis to be able to theorize on that. We need to get to Ishbi-Benob and get into some of the Talmudic legends because they go a little bit deeper with it. And again, I'm not sitting here advocating for everything in the Talmud, but again, I try to read as many different texts as I can so we can see what lines up with the Bible, see what doesn't, and then we can say, okay, I'm in a chew up the meat, swallow it, and spit out the bones, right? That's what we should do with everything. And I think that we should always have a wide range of research when we look at things. So Ishbi-Benob, they go a little bit deeper in the Talmud. And it says that into his hand God delivered David on account of the destruction of the priest city Nob and other misdeeds. Satan masquerading as a deer. So Satan actually shapeshifts into a deer and leads David in pursuit to the land of the Philistines that Ishbi-Benob, he's the brother of Goliath, might discover him. So Satan's trying to lead David to Ishbi-Benob. So when David's led there by Satan, who's masquerading as a deer, Ishbi-Benob gets him and he lays him on the ground under an olive tree and an oil press. So he's trying to suffocate him, smash him, but the earth softens under him and saves him from being crushed. So Abishai, and this is the son of Zeruiah, and he was the leader of the 30 mighty men, and he was known for his bravery, military skill, loyalty to David. There's a ton of wild stories about him as being a mighty man. He defeats like 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He slays 300 men with one spear. And one of his big ones is he rescues David from the giant Ishbi-Benob. And we know this biblically with Abishai if we go up to 2 Samuel 21:17. But Abishai, son of Zeruiah, secured him and smote the Philistine and killed him. And the men of David swear unto him, saying, Thou shalt go no more out with us to battle, that thou quench not the light of Israel. So at that point, they're saying, David, you can't come out with us anymore. We're the mighty men. We're your special ops team. You need to rule, and we don't need you fighting out anymore. I mean, props to David. He's still going out there and battling these giants, but Abishai's like, no, we're done. We're done with you coming out here. And honestly, I'm done saving your tail is basically what he's telling him. So back to the Talmud in this story here, because I just think it's interesting, whether it's true or not, but it's very interesting. So Abishai is actually on the toilet and he detects blood in his stool. And in some other accounts, it was a dove in distress that he beheld. So the circumstances let him know something's going on with David. So he goes looking for his king in his house, can't find him, and it's on the Sabbath, so he can't do anything on the Sabbath. So he has to inquire about mounting a royal horse to go save David because it's on the Sabbath. So he gets permission to do it. So he takes off, and the earth is jumping, so the intervening space is vanquished. So basically he's teleporting, which is even wilder. And he actually kills the giant's mother on the way, who is Orpah. And I've talked about Orpah on this show too. I talked about that in the episode of Goliath's magical sword. And go check that episode out because it's a wild one. That's when we get into a lot of crazy Nephilim tech and some ideas there with David and the Philosopher's Stone. He kills Orpah on the way. Abishai rolls up on Ishbi-Benob, who takes hold of David and throws him in the air. And so he places his sword underneath him so he can just run it right through David as he drops. But Abishai pronounces the name, which is I am, Yahweh, and David just suspends in midair, just in stasis. So as David lowers down into safety, Abishai gets him. They run away. The giant starts pursuing them, but realizes that his mother's killed on the way. And then they turn around, they actually dispatch the giant then. So obviously, Talmud's got a little bit different story where it seems like David and Abishai together take down Ishbi-Benob, and that would be the biggest deterrent from taking on board that story completely, because in the Bible, it talks about Abishai saving David and killing Ishbi-Benob to save David, to the point that they don't want even David to come out with them anymore. So that's the interesting connection to Ishbi-Benob and Jericho. Now, whether that connection is actually something that exists or not, we don't know. And it could be two completely different giants. It could just be that their names are very similar, and we've got all these different sources trying to tell a different story from a different time period of the same giant, or in more likely cases, probably two different giants. I'm very open to it being either or. I thought the connection was pretty interesting and I wanted to talk about it. And I just like talking about Ishbi-Benob because he seemingly has some sort of wild Nephilim tech that he likes to break out. Now, I want to look at a place called Beit Jibrin, and this is another example of the Gibberim. And it was an Arab village in the Hebron sub-district of British Mandatory Palestine. And it is today in the state of Israel, which was depopulated during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. So Beit Jibrin means house of the Gibberim, house of the giants. And so the town is still around. and it commands the entrance to the valley of Zephathath on the road to Jerusalem and Gaza, which makes sense. On the road to Jerusalem and Gaza, you've got House of the Gibberim, and some of the caves there in that area measure up to 400 feet long, and the ceilings reach a height of 80 feet. So the idea that giants live in caves, specifically in the Middle East, this really ties some of that together, especially if we want to go down the speculative road. Also, the regional folklore had it that the village was originally inhabited by Canaanites who were said to be a race of giants. So, according to the ancient sources and regional folklore, and just even the name, the House of the Gibberim, House of the Giants, and it's on the road to Jericho, which was another city of giants, is just another example of Nephilim literally all over the place in the Middle East in the past. Let's get to some giant tribes that were in the Bible, and we know these verbatim, and we'll talk about a few of these verses. We'll talk about some of the names of these, which I'm sure some of you have heard me talk about before, but to those that haven't, we're just going to go over some. We got the Rephaim, which we talked about. They mean lofty men, and they lived in an area of ancient Bashan, and we know Og, one of the kings of Bashan, and he was a descendant of the Rephaim and Anakim. We have the Zuzim, that means the tall ones. They actually dwelt north of the Arnon River. We have the Emim, they were the terrible ones. They dwelt on the east side of the Dead Sea in the territory of Moab. And we talked about the Moabites. We talked about some of the lion men of Moab. So it makes sense. We've got a bunch of hybrids rolling around over there on the east side of the Dead Sea. We got the Horim, the cave dwellers. They dwelt to the south of the Dead Sea in Edom. So we know about Mount Seir and the Edomites there. We know of many hybrids rolling around there, and I've talked about that on several episodes. We got the Avim, the dwellers among the ruins, dwelt in the lower portion of Zephalah. We have the Anakim, the long-necked ones. They dwelt around the area of Hebron, and we're going to talk about some of the etymology when it comes to the Anakim. But we're going to read a few verses here. Some of them you probably heard me read before, some of them you might not have. We just want to talk about where biblically it talks about these giants. So we know Genesis 14, 5-7. And in the 14th year came Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him, and smote the Rephaims in Ashtoreth Karnam, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Emims in Shaveh Kithram, and the Horites in their Mount Seir, unto Elparan, which is by the wilderness. And they returned and came to Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites that dwelt in Hazazontamar. Then we're going to jump to Deuteronomy 2, and we're not going to read all these verses, but if you want to look at 2:10-23, this is literally just giants. Verse 10, the Emims dwelt there in times past, a people great and many and tall as the Anakims, which were also accounted giants as the Anakims, but the Moabites called them Emims. And the Horims also dwelt in Seir before time, but the children of Esau succeeded them when they had destroyed them from before them and dwelt in their stead, as Israel did unto the land of his possession, which the Lord gave unto him. And we'll jump to verse 20. That also was accounted a land of giants. Giants dwelt therein old time, and the Ammonites called them Zamzumims. And people great and many and tall as the Anakims, but the Lord destroyed them before them, and they succeeded them and dwelt in their stead. So definitely check out that stretch of verses. Bunch of giant talk. But it gets us into these Anakim. Anakim are very important because during this period of time when Joshua, Caleb, all of them were rolling through, trying to take back the promised land, the Anakim were considered to be peak level, right? They were the talls. They were at that beast-like level. You know, we could look into the 15, 20-foot range, some of these guys. And in Hebrew, the word is Anaki, Anaqiy, and is translated to Anakims, meaning long necks or tall, were the sons of Anak. Translated as Anak, meaning neck, and that just is saying that they were head and shoulders taller of the tallest of men. And you may say, well, I don't believe the Bible, Joel. Is there anything else that talks about the Anakim? Well, actually, there is. There is the Egyptian execration text, and execration texts are actually ancient magical texts from Egypt's Middle Kingdom, and they also function as ritualistic curses against enemies. and they inscribed them on broken clay figurines or vessels. So what they would do, they would put their names on these broken clay figurines or vessels, and they would create this curse. They would break them and bury them, and that would essentially put a curse or some sort of force field. And we're going to talk about it here with the sons of Anak, these Anakim. And in these execration texts, the Anakim are talked about. And they actually, in 1900 and 1700 BC, during these execration texts, they substantiate the biblical account of these gigantic people called the Anakim because the Pharaoh put curses on the Anakim chieftains who lived in Canaan. So he said, stay away, putting curses on you. I'm putting your chieftains' names on these clay figurines, these little vessels, and I'm breaking them. And I'm essentially trying to put up a force field to keep you guys from coming here. So the Anakim were really like the standard, which all the other Rephaim, which I believe would be more of your after flood umbrella for all the Nephilim. And that was just, they were just the ones that all the other giants were measured by. They struck more terror than any of the other ones I talked about. Horim, Avims, Emim, Zuzims, any of the other ones. And Anakim also means people of the necklace or neck piece, because it's talking about how tall their necks were, how tall they were. Now, there are 3 tribes of the Anakim that are actually talked about, and these are talked about by Samuel Bocart, and he's a French Protestant biblical scholar. And what he did with biblical text, he used hermeneutics to look at the classical text, and he put it more in the cultural context of the Greek and Roman societies, which he needed to understand how that when these codexes, these manuscripts were written, how the people that wrote them in their societies would have wrote them, how that when they were translated from the original text, how those cultures would have lived during that time. Again, back to what I said earlier in this, not only context, but understanding the culture within something's been written as well. That's very important, because if we look at scripture or any ancient text through a modern lens, we're going to get flubbed up every time, because what they wrote and meant is not what those words mean to us today a lot of times. And this is where I'm telling you right now, a lot of this stuff happens with the Bible when these new hot theories come out and people cherry pick verses out of the Bible to make those things mean what they want them to mean. Again, they're not looking at context. They're not looking at the Greek and Hebrew. They're not looking at the cultural significance of when those things were written either. So this is what Samuel Bocart was doing. And he talks about 3 tribes of the Anakim, the Sheshe, the Ahaman, and the Talmai. And he breaks down that the Sheshe, which were the tallest of the 3, and he puts them at 6 cubits, which puts them around the 9 to 10 foot range. In his opinion, obviously, we've heard a large scope of a lot taller than that to in between that and everything in between. So that's just according to him. And he's attributing that more so around that Goliath range. Now we're going to look at some extra canonical texts, some of the apocrypha now, and we're definitely going to end it up with Enoch, because I think that's important. But we're going to look at the Book of Jubilees, and it's an ancient Jewish apocryphal text. It's got 50 chapters. Now, it is considered canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo Church, and I've talked about them before, especially in conjunction with Good Nephilim, episode 2, I believe, where I go into them a little bit. But they're really the only group that considers the Book of Jubilees canonical. And Jubilees presents a history of the divisions of the days of the law and of the testimony of the events of the years of their year weeks and their jubilees throughout all the years of the world, as the Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai when he received the 10 commandments. So we're going to look at chapter 5, and this is specifically where they talk about giants, and this is in conjunction with Genesis 6. And it came to pass when the children of men began to multiply on the face of the earth and daughters were born unto them, that the angels of God saw them on a certain year of this jubilee. They were beautiful to look upon. They took themselves wives of all whom they chose, and they bare unto them sons that were giants. And all lawlessness increased on the earth, and all flesh corrupted its way, alike men and cattle and beasts and birds and everything that walks on the earth. All of them corrupted their ways and their orders, and they began to devour each other. And lawlessness increased on the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of all men was thus evilly continually. So this is the idea that fallen angels were corrupting beasts, cattle, birds, everything. This is where these hybrids were coming out, chimera were coming out. But I like Jubilees because it specifically says the angels took women and bared sons who were giants. So this is why we look to the Apocrypha to then go back to Genesis 6, because of all these apocryphal tales are saying the same thing. Well, in conjunction with Beni Ha Elohim, meaning angels, in all the early manuscripts, it has to mean angels. And listen, and you can have all of the doctorates in the world, but if we're not looking at all of these texts outside the Bible and then actually looking at the Hebrew in the Bible to say that means angels, then we're really doing ourselves a disservice. We're really just going out of our way to take the supernatural out of the Bible, in my opinion. I talked to you earlier about Josephus, and we're going to jump to Josephus before we jump back into some Apocrypha stuff, because Josephus wrote Antiquities of the Jews, which I've quoted many times on the show, and he talks about giants a lot. And I'm just going to read a couple of excerpts, but he talks about them a whole lot more than these. And I'm just going to read a couple just so we know that he also, who was a recorder of everything Jewish, he was a slave who was told, you got this job by the Romans, you're going to document everything you can about the Jews from antiquity all the way to the current war. So he also talks about giants and in conjunction with angels. He says, for many angels, this notion that the fallen angels were in some sense the fathers of the old giants was the constant opinion of antiquity, of God accompanied with women and begot sons that proved unjust and despisers of all that was good on account of the confidence that they had in their own strength. For the tradition is that these men did what resembled the acts of those whom the Grecians call giants. So he's telling you, this is what the Jews are saying. This is what the Israelites are saying. They've been saying this since the beginning. So he's telling you too. He's just a documenter. He's just writing down what they say and talking about what they believe. He's writing it down. He even says these kings laid waste all Syria and overthrown the offspring of the giants. And when they were come over against Sodom, talking about giants again, he said, for which reason they removed their camp to Hebron. And when they had taken it, they slew all the inhabitants. There were till then left a race of giants who had bodies so large and countenance so entirely different from other men that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. The bones of these men are still shown to this very day, unlike to any credible relations of other men. Now they gave this city to the Levites as an extraordinary reward. So he was even talking about giant bones were still being displayed during his time. I just don't understand how biblical scholars, ethically biblical scholars, can say that Genesis 6 does not mean fallen angels procreating with women to create giants. Again, I just don't think you're being ethical at this point, because every single other scholar throughout history is saying this, Josephus being one of them. And he's just a recorder. He's just, hey, I'm going to tell you what they're telling me, what they've talked about for thousands of years. I'm writing it down. Matter of fact, I've seen giant bones. I'm just letting you know. They're being showcased, even during my time. So now we're going to jump to the book of Jasher. Now, Jasher is an interesting book in that the Bible actually talks about the book of Jasher. So it's another non-canonical book that I believe holds a lot of weight because the Bible also talks about it. And we're going to look at a couple verses where it's specifically talked about. We're looking at Joshua 10:13, and the sun stood still and the moon stayed until the people had avenged themselves on their enemies. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? And this is when Joshua was battling Adonizedek and his allies, and he prayed for the sun and moon to stand still until he defeated him. You're saying it was written in the book of Jasher, which it is. So the Bible is specifically talking about that. Another verse that I've talked about plenty of times is 2 Samuel 1:18. And he ordered that the sons of Judah be taught the song of the bow. It is written in the book of Jasher. So there are two specific times that the Bible talks about the book of Jasher. So again, I think that the book of Jasher does hold weight. I will say in Jasher chapter 4, when it talks about the daughters of men and the sons of men taking them. It talks about the judges and rulers went to these daughters of men. Those are the names being used for angels here. So they don't specifically use the word angels, but they do talk about giants, because if we go to chapter 85, they start specifically talking about the Amorites. They start specifically talking about Og. They talk about his brother Sion. They go into great detail of the battle of taking down Og and Sion and them being giants. So we do know that giants are talked about also in the book of Jasher. Now, to get to the main book, the Book of Enoch, and it is ascribed by tradition to the patriarch Enoch, who was the father of Methuselah and the great-grandfather of Noah. And it contains the most explicit material when we're talking about angels falling from heaven, fallen angels, taking women, procreating with them. He names out a bunch of fallen angels by name. We're going to talk about that here in a second. We're going to talk about how fallen angels were teaching mankind all kind of technologies. And he talks about what happened with the giants, what happened to the ones that decided that they did not want redemption. And I know people who have just joined this channel are like, what are you talking about, giants and redemption? Go listen to the Good Nephilim series. I break down the Book of Enoch here, and I break down the Book of Giants, which is also tied in to the Book of Enoch. And it's another apocryphal book. And I break down a bunch of different aspects. But let's just talk about the evil giants here, which is the majority. And they do not turn, and their spirits become the demonic spirits. And this is specifically talked about here in the Book of Enoch. Do we hold the Book of Enoch with any kind of weight? Does the Bible talk about the Book of Enoch? Well, it absolutely does. So we look at Jude 14 through 15. It was also about these that Enoch in the seventh generation from Adam prophesied, saying, see, the Lord is coming with tens thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment on all and to convict everyone of all the deeds of ungodliness that have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things that ungodly sinners have spoken against him. So we have to look at 1 Enoch 1:91. Behold, he comes with the myriads of his holy ones to execute judgment on all and to destroy all the wicked and to convict all flesh for all the wicked deeds that have and the proud and hard words that wicked sinners spoke against him. So it's almost verbatim quoting Jude is of the Book of Enoch, chapter 1, verse 91. So pretty spot on. And that's where most people get this idea that the Book of Enoch should be held in high regard. There are groups that do put it in the Bible, have added it as part of the canon. I don't believe it should be part of the canon. And one day I will do an episode on that, I promise you. But, I'm not going to beef with you if you think it should be in there. I think it's an important book, but I do think there are some things in it that have caused it to be rejected by God. And I'm going to say that by God, not by man. So we're going to look at Enoch chapter 6, and we're going to break down some of the early parts of what they were doing when they were taking wives, and then what happened to the giants. And it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them and said one to another, come, let us choose wives from among the children of men and beget us children. And Simjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear ye will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of great sin. He's alluding to the fact that Yahweh will punish them and throw them into the pit, which he does. And they all answered him and said, let us all swear an oath and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. Then swear they all together and bound themselves. So they're like, we're going to swear this oath on the summit of Mount Hermon. All of them do. And there are several names that are named here. And obviously you can go to the Book of Enoch and check out all the fallen angel names. Now we go to chapter 7. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. And they began to go in unto them and defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments and the cutting of root hearts and made them acquainted with plants. They became pregnant and they bare great giants whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. When men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. They began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish and devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. And the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. So they create these giants. This is where we get these 450-foot giants, by the way. That was the verse, the 3,000 ells. So, again, I don't think they were 450 feet tall, but open to being wrong. If there are 450-foot giants, that's pretty wild. Went nuts. These giants are going crazy. And you check out the Book of Giants. It's very interesting in them having these dreams, Gilgamesh having these dreams, and Mahaway, and them figuring out that destruction is coming for all the stuff they're doing and their fathers are telling them to do. As a matter of fact, their fathers, and we're talking about Azazel, he actually taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates. This is chapter 8. And it goes down the line. Shemjaz is teaching, Amaros is teaching enchantments. We've got Arakiel, the signs of the earth, and astrology. And again, you can check this out in chapter 8. But this is the idea of the trading with men, the technology to get access to the women. And we can argue about how they got the women. Did the women really want to go with them? Or is this some sort of arranged marriages that their fathers were putting them in? Were they being taken, i.e. abductions? There's so many different aspects of this that we could go down. And I don't have the answer to that. I could even argue that it could be a combination of all of them. Maybe some women wanted to do it. Maybe some women didn't, and their fathers made them do it. Maybe some women were taken. Could have been a combination of all of it. So in chapter 15, this is where we know about the giants becoming these spirits. In verse 8, now the giants who are produced from the spirits and flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men, and from the holy watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on the earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. As for the spirits of heaven, in heaven shall be their dwelling. But as for the spirits of earth, which were born upon the earth shall be their dwelling. The spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on earth, and cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst, and cause offenses. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against the women, because they have proceeded from them. And then we look in chapter 16. You have been in heaven, but all the mysteries had not been revealed to you. You knew worthless ones, and these in the hardness of your hearts you have made known to the women. And through these mysteries, women and men work much evil on earth. Say to them, therefore, you have no peace. So we're talking about these Nephilim that die in the flood, and they will be evil spirits on the earth, and they will cause havoc and destruction and hunger and thirst. And the hunger and thirst is looking for people to possess, looking for vessels, looking for something to inhabit. And I need you to keep that part in your mind, because this is the place that we're going to go, the road we're going to drive into as we get to this revealing of what the Nephilim Portal Babies are. How are they created? What do they really mean? We'll really get into that in part 3. But part 2, we're really going to get into the builder part and the first secret society, the Brotherhood of the Snake. We're going to get into Cain. We're going to get into his son, Evil Enoch, which there are 2 Enochs. And then we're going to get into Tubal-Cain. We're going to get into some of that stuff before the flood. It's very important to talk about the early secret societies, how they connect to the new secret societies, and what that brokering of the deal has happened over time. Not just Enoch here, with the teaching of enchantments and technologies from the fallen angels, but also now. And then really in part 3, we're going to get into the modern era of how all of this early Nephilim groundwork we've laid plays into our modern times and what the new version of that is, because we got to talk about it in a new light. It's done differently. You know, what does a Nephilim Portal Baby mean? And we'll get into that. I'm excited to really go deep with this, because I've never gone this deep before on this particular theory. And I'm excited for you guys to hear it. Guys, thank you so much for being here. If you can, I know you guys have been doing a good job, but if you can, please go give me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Write a review there. Go give me a 5-star review on Spotify as well. If you're here on YouTube, go comment. go hit the hype button. There's a new hype button. I think you can hype it 3 times per time you do that. The more hype it gets, the more it gets into the algorithm and more people will get to the episode. Also, make sure you go to my merch store. I've got Nephilim Portal Baby shirts there, plus a ton of other gear. Just go to freetherabbits.myshopify.com, and I'm always adding new merchandise there as well. Also, go to merkelfilms.com and check out the new documentary, The Meadow Project. We've also got over 2 hours of additional footage that we've added as bonus footage that is really cool. So when you go purchase it or rent it there, you get access to almost 4 hours of footage. So you can't beat that. It's very interesting stuff. Go check it out. Also, on the way out, I'm going to play my new single, which is also played at the end of the Meadow Project. It's called Imposter, and you know what it is, guys. Go outside, touch grass, and get your tail out the hole.
I'm in a fun house, locked in a boxcar with all of these clowns. Don't feel like I belong, but maybe I do. Cause when I look in the puddle, maybe I'm just a ruse. Or maybe I'm just confused. Ooh, I'm a gorilla in the jungle, but my mind's got me trapped in the zoo. Ooh, what you see is not what I see. Cause I could be dreams that feel like nightmares, will they end? My reality's more friendly than pretend. And I don't know if my perception's innocent. I'm never satisfied, I'm looking to transcend. Real me gets confused with the clones I create on my own. My palace corridors to the lab, it's a throne. Pyramids of deception above the halls of a minty. If I leave, will I even miss me? Yeah. Face to face with my ambition, yeah. My position with me, I'm in competition, yeah. I could be superstitious, cause it feels like it's a sickness. What you see is not what I see.